I paid $12,000 extra for the safest neighborhood in the state, but no one warned me about Karen. By day 30, she'd fined me for unauthorized daffodils. By day 45, construction trucks destroyed my driveway. When I fought back, she sent cops to my door. This is how a 42-year-old HOA president with a clipboard and a vendetta turned my dream home into a war zone. And why I risked everything to expose the corruption rotting our suburb from the inside. I remember the day I moved into Willow Creek Estates, feeling like I'd finally made it. My new house had a spacious yard, tree-lined streets, and the quiet promise of suburban peace. The "Welcome to Willow Creek" basket on my doorstep looked thoughtful at first, until I noticed the thick HOA bylaws tucked under the muffins. Karen's name was underlined twice. Everyone said Willow Creek was the kind of place where neighbors greeted you with a smile, but that wasn't quite what I experienced. In those first few days, I noticed small signs that suggested life here might be more complicated. A neighbor quietly warned me to keep up appearances, and another whispered that questioning the president's decisions was bad form. I shrugged it off, assuming they were exaggerating. How bad could one HOA president be? I soon found out. By my second week, I'd already seen Karen's name plastered on every official notice. She wore floral dresses, kept a steely gaze, and carried an air of authority that felt oddly intimidating. When I attended my first HOA gathering, she stood at the podium with her clipboard, rattling off new improvements that would require extra fees. Her voice was firm, almost militaristic. I raised my hand to ask how these fees were calculated. In that instant, Karen's smile disappeared. She shot me a glare so icy I nearly dropped my notes. "We all contribute equally," she said, as if reciting a sacred oath. I pressed politely, asking for a breakdown of how funds were allocated. Her eyes narrowed. That's when I realized stepping out of line, even gently, would make me a target. That's also when I learned Karen could transform from polite to punishing in a heartbeat. I tried to stay on her good side. I planted flowers out front, hoping to spruce up the yard. A few daffodils, a couple of rose bushes, nothing extravagant. A week later, I got a notice from the HOA, a fine for unauthorized daffodils. It wasn't a jaw-dropping sum, but the principle infuriated me. There was no mention of daffodils in any bylaw I'd read. Around the same time, construction trucks from a nearby development started using my driveway as a convenient shortcut. I asked the foreman to reroute them. He mumbled an apology, but the trucks kept coming, leaving tire ruts and concrete cracks in their wake. So, I put up a simple chain across my driveway to stop them. Within 24 hours, Karen showed up. "That chain violates neighborhood aesthetics," she snapped. "Remove it immediately." "They're trespassing," I said, trying to stay calm. "I'm allowed to protect my own property." She waved her clipboard at me like a sword. "We'll see about that." I thought $500 fines were bad. Then I learned what happens when you humiliate a dictator at her own meeting. 2 days later, I got a formal letter from the HOA, an unauthorized modification violation, plus a $500 fine. Enraged, I called the HOA office and heard Karen's condescending voice. "Rules are rules," she said. I researched local property laws and discovered that her claim about the chain was sketchy at best. Feeling empowered, I put the chain back up and added a private property sign. That's when Karen decided to show just how far she'd go. One morning, I woke to banging on my front door. Karen stood there, flanked by 2 police officers. "He's obstructing community access," she declared, voice dripping with indignation. I held firm. "Officers, this is private property. She has no right to remove my chain." The cops looked uncomfortable. Karen stammered something about community standards. With no evidence of a crime, the officers left. Her glare could have scorched my lawn on the spot. That night, I discovered the chain had been cut. Furious, I installed a security camera. The next morning, the footage showed Karen herself, under cover of darkness, snipping the chain with 2 men I recognized as the construction foreman's crew. Armed with evidence, I decided to confront her at the next HOA meeting. Walking into that meeting, I felt a mix of anger and determination. Karen stood at the front, her usual smug posture on full display. The typical announcements droned on: landscaping fees, minor noise complaints, until the floor opened for questions. I raised my hand. "I have an issue," I said, plugging in my laptop to the projector. Karen's confident smirk flickered as the screen lit up. Then I played the footage. Karen, in the dead of night, cutting my chain with the help of 2 construction workers. Gasps filled the room. "That's a violation of my privacy," Karen shrieked. "You can't just record people." "It's my property," I replied. I can record suspicious activity. You're trespassing and vandalizing. Neighbors murmured and nodded. A few brave souls piped up with their own grievances. Someone demanded to know where the HOA's money was going. Another questioned Karen's authority to impose random fines. Chaos erupted. Karen's face went red as more neighbors accused her of heavy-handed tactics. By the end of the meeting, the board agreed to an independent audit of HOA finances. Karen stormed out. The tension was so thick, I could practically taste it. That night, I woke to the sound of shattering glass. My car windshield had been smashed. A scribbled note under the wiper read, "Back off or else." The police filed it under possible teenage vandalism, but I suspected Karen or her cronies. A review of my security footage showed the same construction workers lurking near my property. It was time to escalate. I contacted Samantha Hayes, an investigative journalist known for exposing shady local politics. I emailed her the footage, the fines, the chain-cutting incident. She responded within hours. "This could be a major story," she said when we met. "HOA corruption isn't new, but this is extreme." We started digging into public records. Lo and behold, Karen's husband ran a shell corporation that had suspicious payments linked to the construction company. It wasn't just unethical, it looked criminal. For most people, the next step would be to call the cops again. But I knew Karen would spin it. Instead, I teamed up with Samantha to gather more proof. I thought my biggest problem was $500 fines and a shattered windshield, until a drone started hovering outside my bedroom window. Its camera lens glinted in the moonlight. Furious, I grabbed a flashlight and aimed it at the drone. It zipped away. The next morning, my security footage showed Karen retrieving it from the park. Unapproved surveillance? She'd once accused me, but apparently, it was fine when she spied on me. When I confronted her, loudly, in front of neighbors, she lost her cool and called the police again. This time, they warned her about trespassing and harassment charges. Meanwhile, Samantha published her first exposé, Corruption in Willow Creek, HOA President's Dirty Deals. It went viral in our county, and soon reporters were asking neighbors about Karen's questionable tactics. Under mounting pressure, the HOA board held an emergency meeting. Tension crackled in the air. Karen marched in late, looking rattled but trying to hide it. "These accusations are baseless," she began. "Everything I've done is for the betterment of Willow Creek Estates." I couldn't hold back. "Betterment? You mean lining your pockets with construction kickbacks?" Her face turned scarlet. "You have no idea what you're talking about." "Then why were your payments hidden?" Samantha chimed in, stepping forward. She had copies of bank transfers linking Karen's husband's shell corporation to the construction company. A chorus of angry voices erupted. Someone yelled about skyrocketing HOA fees. Another demanded Karen's resignation. The uproar ended with a unanimous vote to suspend her pending further investigation. I hoped that would be the turning point, that the worst was over. But as I left the building, I felt eyes on me. My intuition screamed that Karen wasn't finished. The next morning, I opened my mailbox to find a plain envelope with a typewritten note. "Drop this now. You don't know who you're dealing with." I showed it to the police, but they offered little more than a shrug. "Could be a prank," they said. I wasn't convinced. One night, I spotted an unfamiliar car idling down the street, headlights off. I snapped a photo before it sped away. Through Samantha's contacts, we traced the license plate to one of the contractors who had helped Karen cut my chain. Clearly, they were still lurking. Then came the worst blow yet. Around midnight, I awoke to the sound of a loud crash and smelled smoke. My brand new shed, in the backyard where the fence had been repaired, was engulfed in flames. I managed to douse some of it with a fire extinguisher before the fire department arrived. The chief confirmed what I suspected: accelerant had been used. This was arson. "That note wasn't paper, it was gasoline," I muttered bitterly, staring at the charred remains. I'd spent years saving for this house. Now, I'd burn it down myself to end this. Samantha refused to let the arson intimidate her. She connected it to a string of fires linked to the same construction firm. Turns out that company had a track record of strong-arming homeowners who stood in their way. By now, Karen was suspended from the HOA, but her influence lingered like a bad smell. We uncovered more evidence of forged documents, unauthorized fines, and personal expenses billed to the HOA. The deeper we dug, the more we realized we were dealing with a broad conspiracy, and Karen was only one piece of the puzzle. Still, she'd been the face of this corruption, and the entire scheme was unraveling fast. The local authorities finally took notice. Police started questioning not just Karen but also her husband and the lead construction manager. Even though Karen was out, the HOA needed to be rebuilt from the inside. An interim board tried to bring residents together. Town hall meetings replaced Karen's old autocratic style. People shared how Karen had bullied them into paying for repairs that should have been covered by community funds. Mrs. Harper tearfully recounted how she'd spent thousands she didn't have, all under Karen's threatening letters. She told me if I didn't comply, my home would be considered in violation, Mrs. Harper sobbed. The new board was transparent, hiring independent auditors to review every penny of HOA. Samantha reported on these changes, shining a spotlight on how a once docile neighborhood was reclaiming its voice. Neighbors still had doubts, and trust wouldn't come easy. But the gloom that hung over Willow Creek Estates began to lift. Yards were tidied again, small gatherings sparked new friendships, and people started to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could move forward without fear of Karen's retaliation. In the midst of this transition, some neighbors urged me to run for the HOA board. "You stood up to Karen," they said. "We need that kind of backbone." At first, I hesitated. After everything I'd been through, diving into the administrative side of the HOA felt like volunteering for another nightmare. But I realized that real change only happens when people are willing to lead. So I launched a grassroots campaign, promising openness and fairness. I held informal gatherings in my backyard, still blackened from the arson attempt, where neighbors could voice concerns. The turnout surprised me. Folks were hungry for honesty after months, maybe years, of Karen's manipulations. Election day came, and I won by a landslide. My first goal was to reverse any fines that had been improperly issued. Then I proposed a new dispute resolution system that prioritized dialogue over punishment. The old board's secrecy was replaced with a community forum where residents could vote on big decisions. For the first time, Willow Creek Estates felt like it truly belonged to all of us. Despite the positive shifts, Karen's legal case loomed in the background. Samantha's exposé had gone viral, and the police investigation was in full force. But Karen's lawyers tried every trick to delay the proceedings. Meanwhile, we kept encountering signs that someone, or several someones, were determined to keep the old guard's power alive. I'd see that suspicious car parked near my house. Anonymous notes would appear in my mailbox, warning me to stop. Once, late at night, someone pounded on my windows, then ran off before I could see who it was. It was a psychological game, a constant reminder that Karen's network wasn't above terrorizing me. Still, I refused to budge. "Chains can't stop a woman who rewrites rules over Pinot Grigio," I muttered to a neighbor once, trying to find humor in the chaos. But I remained vigilant, doubling down on security measures. The mental toll was severe. Some nights I found myself jolting awake at every creak in the house. Finally, after months of legal wrangling, Karen's court date arrived. Media vans lined the courthouse parking lot. Neighbors, once too afraid to speak, crowded into the gallery. Samantha and I both testified. The prosecution's evidence was overwhelming. Forged HOA documents, suspicious money transfers, testimonies about intimidation and vandalism, and of course, the security footage of Karen literally cutting my chain. The construction company executives faced charges as well, some of them pleading guilty to avoid harsher sentences. Karen tried to portray herself as a victim, a pawn in a bigger corporate scheme, but nobody was buying it. The jury listened intently to each piece of evidence, and over the course of several weeks, her defense crumbled. "She wasn't always like this," Karen's husband muttered to me in the hallway one afternoon. He looked defeated, as if watching his world collapse. He handed me a folded letter, Karen's resignation from the HOA board. "I'm sorry," he whispered. It was a strange moment. Part of me felt a flicker of pity, but it was drowned out by memories of the vandalism, the threats, the arson. When the verdict came down, guilty on embezzlement, conspiracy, and multiple counts of vandalism, Karen's composure finally cracked. She received a prison sentence. The construction company faced hefty fines and was barred from further projects in our area. Samantha's articles drew national attention, sparking conversations about the unchecked power of HOAs. Some victories feel triumphant. This one felt more like relief mingled with exhaustion. I'd won, but at a cost: shattered windows, a burned shed, endless stress. Still, the community rallied around me, and together we began the slow process of real healing. With Karen gone, the HOA regained credibility under its newly elected board. Finances were openly reported, major decisions required direct votes, and the sense of fear that once gripped Willow Creek Estates dissipated. Sidewalks were repaired, the park was cleaned up, and we hosted a neighborhood barbecue, something unheard of during Karen's reign. I served my term on the board, then stepped down. The experience left me tired, but it also showed me the power of standing firm against bullying and corruption. My driveway chain remained, and this time nobody dared to cut it. I'll admit, though, that even after Karen was locked away, there were moments when I'd see a car idling at the curb and wonder if some piece of her old network lingered. Because some secrets don't burn, they just wait. Karen got 3 years. The construction CEO got 18 months. My driveway still has a few cracks. Some nights I find myself glancing toward the streetlights, half expecting to see that drone again. Every so often, I bump into Mrs. Harper. She thanks me in a hushed tone, then quickly looks away, maybe remembering how she once stood silent while Karen ran amok. We did what was necessary to expose a system built on greed and intimidation, but the wounds haven't vanished overnight. I guess that's the price of justice. I risked everything to protect my home, and in the end, I saved more than just a driveway. Willow Creek Estates is no longer perfect. Maybe it never was, but it's honest now. And for me, that's worth every fine, every threat, and every minute of lost sleep. I paid extra for the safest neighborhood in the state. I got a war zone instead. But sometimes you have to fight for peace. And if I learned one thing from the remains of my burned shed, it's this. Once the flames die down, you see what really matters. And in Willow, that's a community learning to stand together, free from the chokehold of a clipboard-wielding dictator who thought she was untouchable, until she wasn't.